Okay guys, tonight we begin with something wonderfully unglamorous. No crowns. No velvet capes. No powdered wigs collapsing under the weight of dynastic ego. Instead, we're slipping quietly into the medieval night. The kind of night that is properly dark. Not, I forgot to charge my phone, dark. I mean the sort of darkness where the moon is your only streetlight and even that feels unreliable. So dim your lights. Maybe lower the screen brightness just a little. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders sink. Tonight we're drifting into the slow, smoky world of night watchmen, town criers, and candle makers. The people who kept medieval towns functioning while everyone else tried very hard not to think about rats. Let's begin when the sun goes down. In a medieval town, sunset was not cozy. It was a deadline. Once the last orange strip of daylight slid below the rooftops, daily life shut down with remarkable efficiency. There were no glowing storefronts. No gentle porch lights. No reassuring hum of electricity. There was just shadow. And shadow had a personality. It creaked. It shuffled. It suggested things. Which is why towns appointed night watchmen. The night watchman was rarely anyone's childhood dream. No one in 1324 said, "When I grow up, I want to pace around in the cold shouting the time." But it was a job. And in many towns, it was mandatory service. Meaning if you were a reasonably able-bodied man, congratulations. You might be handed a spear and told to walk in circles until sunrise. The watchman's equipment was simple. A lantern. A staff or halberd. Sometimes a horn. Occasionally a bell. The lantern was essential. And also deeply underwhelming. Medieval lanterns did not blaze heroically. They sort of glowed with uncertainty. Enough to see the cobblestones. Not enough to feel brave. The job description was equally modest. Walk the streets. Call out the hour. Look for fires. Discourage crime by existing. That last part was important. Medieval policing was less about investigation and more about vibes. If a suspicious person saw a watchman approaching with a lantern, they might reconsider whatever mildly illegal idea they were developing. Of course, some watchmen took their role very seriously. They would pace with dramatic importance, clearing their throats before announcing, 10 of the clock, and all is well. Which was optimistic. Other watchmen treated the job like an extended, slow-motion stroll. They leaned against walls. They napped in doorways. They found warm bakeries and lingered nearby. Because yes, even in the 14th century, people cut corners at work. Some towns fined watchmen for sleeping on duty. Which implies it happened a lot. And then there were the fires. Fire was the true villain of the medieval night. Not bandits. Not ghosts. Fire. Towns were made of wood. Roofs were thatched. Chimneys were unreliable. One careless ember and suddenly half the town was participating in an unwanted bonfire. So the watchman's ears were tuned for crackling. His nose for smoke. If he spotted flames, he rang his bell or blew his horn. And then everyone poured out of their homes in various stages of dress, forming bucket lines with sleepy determination. It was community bonding. But with panic. Let's float gently from the streets to the rooftops. Above the cobbles and alleyways, sometimes perched in towers, were additional watchers. Especially in larger cities. In places like London, night watching became increasingly organized over the centuries. By the late medieval period, wards had structured patrols. There were rules. Rotations. Expectations. Which sounds efficient. It wasn't always. Complaints about lazy watchmen appear frequently in city records. Citizens accused them of drinking. Of chatting instead of patrolling. Of being suspiciously absent during actual disturbances. Human nature, it turns out, is very stable across time. Now, as our watchman continues his slow circuit, lantern swaying gently, let's listen for another voice drifting through the dark. The town crier. If the watchman owned the night, the town crier owned the morning. The crier was the human newspaper. The push notification of 1450. He stood in marketplaces. At crossroads. Outside churches. And he shouted. Loudly. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Which essentially meant, hey. You. Yes, you. Stop buying turnips and listen. Town criers were official positions in many cities, including York and Edinburgh. They were appointed by local authorities. And their lungs were municipal property. Because literacy rates were not exactly soaring, spoken announcements were crucial. Royal decrees. Tax changes. Market regulations. Lost livestock. Upcoming executions. It all came through the crier. Imagine being the person tasked with announcing new taxes to a crowd already suspicious of authority. It required projection. And possibly speed. Criers often carried bells to gather attention. They dressed distinctively. Some wore elaborate coats or badges of office. Visibility mattered. You wanted people to recognize you before you started yelling about grain prices. Interestingly, the crier's role was protected. In England, harming a town crier could technically be considered treason, because he spoke with the king's authority. Which is a heavy burden for someone whose main tool was shouting. There is something strangely intimate about the town crier's job. He entered people's daily rhythms. He shaped what they knew about the world. And sometimes what they feared. News traveled slowly. But when it arrived loudly. Now, let's soften the noise and step inside. Into a workshop that smells faintly of tallow. Because without candle makers, both watchmen and criers would have been dramatically less effective. The medieval world ran on candles. Monasteries needed them for night prayers. Nobles needed them for banquets. Ordinary households needed them for basic survival after sunset. Productivity. Or at least fewer accidents involving furniture. There were two main types of candles. tallow candles, made from animal fat, and beeswax candles, made from, well, bees. Tallow was cheap. It was also smelly. When burned, it released a scent best described as farm-adjacent. Beeswax was cleaner, brighter, and far more expensive. So if you walked into a grand cathedral glowing with steady, golden light, you were witnessing beeswax wealth. If you sat in a modest cottage squinting through smoky haze, you were experiencing tallow realism. Candle making was labor-intensive. Animal fat had to be rendered, cleaned, melted, poured or dipped repeatedly around a wick. The dipping method required patience. A wick was dipped into hot fat, then cooled, then dipped again. Over and over. Each layer adding thickness. It was repetitive. Slow. Slightly greasy. And deeply essential. In cities like Paris, chandlers, or candle makers, formed guilds. They regulated quality, prices, materials. Because when your product literally lights the night, standards matter. Guild membership also meant politics. Rivalries between tallow chandlers and wax chandlers could become surprisingly intense. Because of course they could. Humans will form factions over anything. Now imagine the watchman again. Lantern in hand. The flame inside sustained by someone who spent all day dipping wicks into liquefied cow fat. There is a quiet interdependence here. The watchman depends on the candle maker. The town crier depends on daylight and crowds. The entire town depends on everyone else not falling asleep at the wrong moment. And through it all, the night stretches long. In winter, especially, darkness lingered like an uninvited guest. In Northern Europe, nights could last 16 hours or more. That's a lot of time to patrol. Or to worry. Some watchmen developed reputations. Local legends grew. The reliable one. The cowardly one. The one who swore he saw ghosts near the old well. Medieval people did not separate the practical from the supernatural as neatly as we do. A strange sound in an alley might be a cat. Or it might be something more poetic. Watchmen sometimes doubled as informal storytellers, sharing rumors during quiet stretches, passing along half-remembered tales. Because when you walk in darkness long enough, your imagination stretches. And yet, most nights were uneventful. Cobblestones. Cold air. A distant dog barking. The soft announcement of the hour. Midnight. And all is well. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But the rhythm mattered. The predictability was comforting. The town crier would rise the next morning. Clear his throat. Ring his bell. Announce that the baker had been fined. Or that a new law regarding pig containment was now in effect. And life would continue. The candle maker would trim wicks. Melt wax. Count coins. Wipe grease from his apron. The watchman would sleep during daylight. Perhaps grumbling about sore feet. No one would write epic poems about them. No tapestries would depict their lantern routes in heroic thread. But they were the quiet infrastructure of medieval existence. Without them, the night would have been darker, the news slower, the risk higher. And somehow, there is something soothing about that. Not kings. Not conquests. Just ordinary people performing repetitive tasks under the glow of handmade light. As our lantern flickers lower and the town settles into early dawn, we'll let the watchman finish his round. The sky lightens slightly. A pale wash of gray over rooftops. Soon the baker will open his shutters. The crier will test his voice. The candle maker will inspect yesterday's batch. And the medieval town will stretch, yawn, and begin again. Hey guys, tonight we begin with flour in the air and sparks in the dark. So settle in. Lower the lights. Let the room soften around you. Imagine the faint smell of bread drifting through narrow streets long before sunrise. Somewhere, a hammer rings slowly against iron. Not loudly. Just steadily. Like a heartbeat made of metal. We are not with kings tonight. Not yet. We are with the people who made kings possible. The ones who fed them, armed them, shoed their horses, and quietly judged their life choices while kneading dough. Let's drift into a medieval town around 3 in the morning. The sky is black. The streets are quiet. Everyone sensible is asleep. Except the bakers. Bakers lived in a strange time zone. Their day began when everyone else was at their most horizontal. Because bread does not care about your circadian rhythm. Bread rises when it rises. In cities like Paris, baking was serious business. Bread was not a side dish. It was the meal. For the poor especially, bread could make up more than half of daily calories. If bread failed, everything failed. Which meant bakers carried enormous responsibility. And a mild, permanent layer of flour on their eyebrows. The process began with lighting the oven. Medieval ovens were massive stone domes. They had to be heated for hours before use. Wood was stacked inside. Burned down to embers. The baker then raked out the ash, wiped the interior with a damp cloth, and slid in the loaves. Temperature control was achieved through intuition and hand gestures. There were no digital displays. No polite beeping sounds. Just experience. And sometimes guesswork. And then there was the dough. Flour quality varied wildly. Some years the wheat was good. Some years it was damp. Or moldy. Or full of things that were technically not wheat. Bakers had to adjust constantly. Add more water. Less yeast. Pray gently. Guilds regulated baking in many towns. In London, the Worshipful Company of Bakers enforced strict rules. The size and weight of loaves were monitored. Prices were often controlled by local authorities. If you sold underweight bread, you could be fined. Or publicly humiliated. There was even something called the size of bread. Which sounds calm and administrative. It was not calm if you were caught cheating. Punishments could involve standing in the pillory with stale bread hung around your neck. Nothing says career setback like being displayed next to your own disappointing product. But most bakers were simply tired. They worked in intense heat. They inhaled smoke. They lifted heavy sacks of grain. They rarely slept at normal hours. And yet, by sunrise, their windows glowed warmly. Fresh loaves lined up in rows. Steam rising gently. Townspeople would gather early. Because bread waits for no one. There is something deeply comforting about that rhythm. The world might be chaotic. Lords might argue. Borders might shift. But the baker is awake. Now let's drift forward a few hours. The sun has risen. The streets fill with carts and voices. Bread is being torn apart at tables. Crumbs scatter. Children argue over the larger half. And somewhere nearby, metal begins to ring. Let's float over to the blacksmith. If the baker worked with softness and heat, the blacksmith worked with heat and force. The forge was its own universe. Dark walls. A glowing fire. The bellows breathing like some enormous animal. Blacksmiths were essential in ways that are almost difficult to imagine now. They made horseshoes. Nails. Tools. Weapons. Door hinges. Agricultural equipment. Without blacksmiths, society would slowly fall apart. Quite literally. Because things would not stay attached. The blacksmith's day often stretched late into the evening. Especially if orders were backed up. Or if some minor noble decided he urgently required decorative ironwork for a gate that no one asked for. The rhythm was steady. Heat the iron. Remove it from the fire. Hammer it into shape. Return it to heat. Repeat. The sound carried through towns like a metronome. In smaller villages, the blacksmith was a central figure. Physically strong. Slightly intimidating. Frequently covered in soot. People sometimes associated blacksmiths with a touch of the mystical. Fire. Transformation. Metal becoming something else under pressure. It felt almost alchemical. In parts of medieval Germany, smiths were viewed with a mixture of respect and mild suspicion. Because anyone who could bend iron might also be capable of other, more ambiguous talents. Of course, most blacksmiths were simply practical. They repaired plowshares for farmers. Reshod horses worn down by muddy roads. Fixed broken cart wheels. They listened to gossip while hammering. And they aged quickly. The work was hard on the body. Repetitive strain. Burns. Smoke inhalation. Sore backs. Loud noise. There were no ergonomic workshops. No protective goggles. Just instinct and toughness. In cities like Florence, smiths joined guilds much like bakers. Standards were maintained. Apprentices were trained. Secrets of the trade passed quietly from master to student. Apprenticeship was its own long, slow saga. A young boy, often around 12, would be sent to live with a master craftsman. For years he would sweep floors, pump bellows, carry tools, watch closely. He would be corrected frequently, and eventually, if he survived both the heat and the lectures, he might produce a masterpiece. A final object proving his skill. Only then could he open his own forge. Which brings us back to bread. Because blacksmiths needed to eat. And bakers needed tools. And the town moved in circles of dependency. Now let's gently tilt our gaze upward. Above the baker's shop, above the forge, loomed the homes of local elites. Minor nobles, wealthy merchants, people who enjoyed bread without rising at 3 in the morning. People who commissioned iron gates without hammering them. Their lives were softer, but not necessarily simpler. Take a minor noble in 14th century France. He might own a modest estate outside Rouen. He would collect rents, host dinners, complain about taxes imposed by someone more powerful. He would wake later than the baker, eat bread he did not bake, ride horses shod by someone else. And yet, his life might be emotionally chaotic. Dynastic marriages were arranged early. Love was optional. Alliances were everything. He might marry a cousin. Because of course he would. Land needed to stay in the family. Genes, apparently, were negotiable. Children would arrive. Some would survive. Some would not. The emotional climate of medieval households was often subdued but heavy. Letters from the period reveal worry, frustration, quiet grief. The nobleman might obsess over lineage, over producing a male heir, over keeping estates intact. Meanwhile, the baker is still up before dawn. The blacksmith is still hammering. There's a quiet irony there. The elites worried about bloodlines. The craftsmen worried about tomorrow's orders. And in some cases, the elites depended on craftsmen far more than they liked to admit. Let's drift slightly east. In parts of Eastern Europe, especially within the territories that would later form the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, towns functioned similarly. Bakers rose early. Smiths worked late. Nobles, known as szlachta, guarded their privileges fiercely. They prided themselves on equality among themselves, which meant they argued constantly in parliamentary gatherings. While they debated abstract freedoms, someone else was sharpening their swords. There is something strangely soothing about focusing on these daily cycles. The baker's quiet discipline. The smith's steady force. The noble's mild anxiety about inheritance. Nothing explodes. Nothing dramatically collapses. Life continues in measured strokes. And yet, even within these routines, small human dramas unfolded. A baker might fall in love with a miller's daughter. Complicated, because flour politics were surprisingly intense. A blacksmith might resent a rival across town. Their hammers competing in invisible contests of volume and quality. A noble woman might find herself isolated in a stone manor. writing letters, embroidering, waiting for a husband who preferred hunting. History often zooms in on wars, coronations, betrayals. But most people were just tired. The baker wiped sweat from his forehead at 5 in the morning. The blacksmith rubbed his shoulder at dusk. The noble sighed dramatically about estate finances while sitting in relative comfort. And the town breathed in and out around them. As evening returns, the baker finally rests. The blacksmith lets the forge dim. Smoke curls upward into cooling air. Candles are lit. Doors close. Tomorrow will look remarkably similar. Which, in a medieval world of uncertainty, was its own quiet blessing. Hey guys, tonight we begin in the quiet corners. So dim the lights. Let the room settle. Maybe pull the blanket a little closer. Tonight we're not in glittering throne rooms. We're not at triumphant coronations. We're slipping sideways into alleyways. Into locked chests. Into whispered agreements made behind heavy doors. Nothing dramatic. Nothing explosive. Just the slow, slightly awkward reality that wherever there is power, there is also someone quietly skimming off the top. Let's drift into a medieval city at dusk. The gates are closing. The merchants are packing up. The respectable citizens are heading home. And somewhere in the narrowing streets, the shadow economy stretches its legs. In cities like Venice, trade was everything. Ships arrived heavy with spices, silk, and grain. Official ledgers tracked tariffs and duties with careful inkstrokes. But not every sack of pepper passed through official hands. Of course it didn't. Because if you create taxes, someone will invent a workaround. Venice had customs officials, inspectors, dock supervisors. And yet smuggling thrived. A crate miscounted here. A false bottom in a barrel there. A bribe slipped discreetly into the right palm. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Merchants were not necessarily villains. Many were practical. They faced fluctuating markets, unpredictable storms, and the occasional embargo. If skimming a little profit off the books meant survival, well, they adjusted. And the ruling elite of Venice? They knew. The Venetian Republic was governed by patrician families who understood trade intimately. They also understood that too much enforcement could choke commerce. So the system flexed. Publicly strict. Privately accommodating. Let's float gently north. In London during the late Middle Ages, guilds regulated nearly everything. Bakers, fishmongers, goldsmiths. Each trade had rules. And where there are rules, there are loopholes. Take the goldsmiths. Goldsmiths held enormous trust. They handled precious metals. They stored valuables. They even functioned as early bankers. People deposited coins and received written receipts. Which worked beautifully. Until a goldsmith quietly lent out more money than he physically possessed. Early fractional reserve banking, medieval edition. Sometimes it went fine. Sometimes it did not. When it did not, it unraveled slowly. Depositors would appear at once, demanding their silver. The goldsmith would sweat gently and invent delays. No dramatic chases. No cinematic collapses. Just uncomfortable conversations and reputations dissolving like poorly made pastry. Now let's slide into something more intimate. Royal courts. Because if you think shadow economies stop at the marketplace, let's gently reconsider. At court, secrecy had a different flavor. Take Charles VI of France. Charles was known as Charles the Beloved, which is charming. He was also known as Charles the Mad, which complicates things. He suffered from episodes of mental illness, periods where he did not recognize his wife, or believed he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He reportedly feared shattering. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent accidental breakage, which must have made hugging awkward. During his episodes, governance drifted. Power pooled around ambitious relatives. Financial decisions were made in back rooms. Taxes were levied. Funds diverted. When a king is unstable, shadow governance thrives. Courtiers whispered. Alliances shifted. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, navigated a court thick with suspicion. She was accused, fairly or not, of extravagance, of influence, of mismanagement. Behind the tapestries and feasts, money flowed in complicated channels. Royal finances were often chaotic. Kings borrowed constantly. From merchants. From nobles. From foreign bankers. Let's drift south to Florence. Here, banking families like the Medici mastered the art of shadow finance. But Cosimo de' Medici did not technically rule Florence. Not officially. He simply controlled vast wealth, placed allies in key positions, funded public works, and ensured that decisions tended to align with his preferences. Subtle. Cosimo's power operated through loans and favors. Through carefully managed debts. When you owe someone money, you tend to listen to them. Florence prided itself on republican governance. Elections. Councils. Debate. And yet, behind that civic theater, financial influence guided outcomes. Cosimo himself spent time in exile. Politics turned against him briefly. But he returned. Because money, unlike idealism, has a long memory. Shadow economies were not always about gold. Sometimes they were about information. Let's float to the Tudor court. Under Henry VIII, secrecy became almost recreational. Henry's court shimmered with pageantry. But behind the velvet curtains, there were networks of informants. Whispered accusations. Carefully planted rumors. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, built a web of surveillance that would feel surprisingly modern. Letters were intercepted. Alliances monitored. Religious dissent tracked. And of course, money changed hands. Monasteries were dissolved. Their land seized. Wealth redistributed. Publicly, it was reform. Privately, it was redistribution on a grand scale. Henry himself oscillated between grandiosity and insecurity. He married 6 times. Because why address emotional instability when you can rearrange the monarchy? Each marriage had financial implications. Dowries negotiated. Estates transferred. Titles adjusted. Royal love was expensive. Now let's drift eastward again. In the Ottoman Empire, especially under Suleiman the Magnificent, the imperial court at Istanbul thrived on ceremony. But behind the scenes, the harem functioned as its own political ecosystem. Women within the imperial harem wielded influence. Mothers of sultans, in particular, known as Valide sultans, could shape appointments and policies. Gifts circulated. Alliances formed quietly. The empire ran on official bureaucracy, but also on personal networks. And sometimes those networks overlapped with financial maneuvering that never appeared in state records. Let's soften the focus again. Back to ordinary elites. In many European cities, sumptuary laws regulated clothing. Who could wear silk? Who could display fur? Who was permitted gold embroidery? These laws attempted to preserve social hierarchy. They also created a small industry of quiet defiance. Merchants found ways to bend regulations. Subtler fabrics. Slightly modified trims. Jewelry worn just inside sleeves. Status signaling found loopholes. Crime, in medieval contexts, was often mundane. Petty theft. Counterfeit coins. Adulterated wine. In Paris, wine sellers were frequently fined for diluting their product. Watered wine. A timeless disappointment. But even counterfeiters had strange artistry. Coins were clipped carefully. Edges shaved for precious metal. The coin remained mostly intact. Just slightly lighter. Multiply that by hundreds. And suddenly someone has a modest side income. Authorities responded with inspections. Harsh penalties. Yet clipping continued. Because small margins add up. Now let's drift into something quieter still. Monasteries. Places of prayer. Reflection. Silence. Also landowners. Major ones. Monasteries controlled farmland, mills, fisheries. They collected rents. Managed resources. And occasionally, monks proved remarkably skilled at creative accounting. Not all. But enough. Records revealed disputes over tithes. Over grain storage. Over rights to woodland. Piety and profit were not mutually exclusive. Human nature does not change simply because one wears a robe. Even the papacy faced financial complexity. In Avignon during the 14th century, popes managed vast church revenues. Taxes from across Europe flowed toward the papal court. Critics complained of extravagance. Of nepotism. Of indulgences sold too liberally. Money, once centralized, tends to attract scrutiny and resistance. Yet through it all, life remained oddly procedural. Ledgers were kept. Coins counted. Favors exchanged. No dramatic music. Just parchment and ink. Let's gently return to the street level. A merchant closes his shop. He counts coins by candlelight. He sets aside the official portion. Then pauses. Maybe one coin slips quietly into a private pouch. Not greed, he tells himself. Just prudence. Across town, a minor noble negotiates a marriage contract. Dowries calculated. Lands assessed. There are clauses. Conditions. Safeguards. Marriage as financial instrument. Romance optional. In the royal sphere, similar calculations occurred on grander scales. Consider Philip IV of Spain. He inherited a sprawling empire and staggering debts. Spain had silver from the Americas. But silver inflates economies. Prices rose. Debts deepened. Philip relied heavily on ministers, on financiers, on loans. Bankruptcies were declared more than once. Officially. Unofficially, financial maneuvering continued. Empires can declare bankruptcy and still function. If creditors are patient. Or trapped. Philip himself preferred art and ceremony. Governance felt exhausting. Which is convenient when someone else handles the spreadsheets. Let's float over to another royal disaster. The Habsburgs. Ah yes. A dynasty famous for two things. Power. And keeping it very much in the family. Intermarriage among close relatives was common. Land and titles remained consolidated. Genes, again, were treated as flexible. The result was a line of monarchs with increasingly distinctive features. And occasionally fragile health. Charles II of Spain stands as the most poignant example. He was the product of generations of uncle-niece marriages. His jaw was pronounced. His health delicate. His reign overshadowed by physical limitations. Behind him, advisors maneuvered. Courtiers calculated succession. Because when a king struggles physically, political shadow networks strengthen. Charles himself seems to have been gentle. Pious. Not particularly suited to the burdens placed upon him. He died without an heir. Which triggered diplomatic reshuffling across Europe. But even that unfolded through negotiations. Letters. Treaties. Power shifting quietly across parchment. As we settle deeper into this world of secrecy and shadow, notice something. It is rarely explosive. It is gradual. A coin shaved here. A favor granted there. A marriage arranged to secure influence. A debt extended with conditions attached. Crime and shadow economies were not separate from society. They were woven into it. Subtle. Persistent. Almost soothing in their predictability. Tomorrow, the merchant will count again. The noble will review accounts again. The royal minister will whisper again. And somewhere, in a candlelit room, someone will decide that bending the rules just slightly is entirely reasonable. Because history, for all its grand narratives, often moves forward on very small adjustments. So let the alleyways fade. Let the ledgers close. And let the shadows settle softly around the edges of the medieval world. Hey guys, tonight we begin after everyone else has supposedly gone to bed. So lower the lights. Let your phone dim. Maybe shift onto your side. Tonight we're slipping past the obvious parts of history. The daylight ceremonies. The portraits. The official proclamations. We're going into the hours no one painted. The middle of the night. Because while most of medieval and early modern Europe liked to pretend that sleep was simple, it absolutely was not. Let's begin in a royal bedchamber. Picture a vast room in Palace of Versailles. It's the late 17th century. Tapestries on the walls. Heavy curtains. A bed that looks less like furniture and more like architectural ambition. Inside it lies Louis XIV. The Sun King. He called himself that, by the way. Because modesty is exhausting. By midnight, court has technically dispersed. Candles are trimmed. The courtiers bow themselves backward out of the room. Silence settles. Except, not quite. Louis did not simply go to bed. Going to bed, for him, was a performance. The ritual was called the coucher. Courtiers gathered to watch him undress. High-ranking nobles were granted the privilege of handing him a sleeve. Or a nightcap. Because nothing says political hierarchy like competing over who gets to hold the royal sock. And then, finally, the king would lie down. But Louis was not a peaceful sleeper. He suffered from various ailments. Dental problems. Digestive issues. A persistent need for medical interventions that we will describe gently. He often woke during the night. Priests might be summoned. Physicians consulted. Attendants hovered nearby. Even kings had insomnia. Let's float quietly across the English Channel. In the 16th century, Elizabeth I kept unusual hours. Elizabeth preferred working late. She read documents in bed. Held private conversations long after midnight. She liked to maintain control over information. And control thrives in darkness. Her ladies-in-waiting often complained of exhaustion. Because when the Queen decides that 2 a.m. is an excellent time to discuss foreign policy, you smile and nod. Elizabeth's sleep schedule was less about rest and more about vigilance. She had survived plots. Rebellions. Endless pressure to marry. So if she trusted the quiet hours, it was because fewer people were awake to scheme. Midnight, for her, was strategic. Now let's drift into something softer. Medieval households often practiced what historians call segmented sleep. People went to bed shortly after sunset. Slept for several hours. Then woke up around midnight. Not in panic. Just awake. They would sit by the fire. Pray. Talk quietly. Tend to small chores. Then return to bed for a second sleep. It was normal. No dramatic tossing and turning. No existential dread. Just a calm interval of wakefulness. In rural France or England, this middle watch was practical. A farmer might check on animals. A mother might nurse a child. The world felt suspended. The darkness was thick, but familiar. Now let's gently move into a more anxious bedchamber. In 17th century Spain, Charles II of Spain lay awake often. Charles was the final Habsburg king of Spain. The product of generations of very close family marriages. His health was fragile. His jaw prominent. His digestion unreliable. He was deeply religious. Prone to melancholy. At night, he worried about heirs. Or rather, the lack of them. His marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg produced no surviving children. Which meant that while Charles stared at the canopy of his bed, Europe quietly stared at him. Succession questions lingered in the dark. Physicians tried various remedies. None effective. Courtiers whispered. Diplomats drafted contingency plans. And Charles prayed. Midnight, for him, was heavy. Let's float east. In the Ottoman Empire, within the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, the Sultan's nighttime was structured but guarded. Suleiman the Magnificent was disciplined. He worked late. Read reports. Reviewed correspondence. The imperial harem was silent but watchful. Eunuchs guarded corridors. Lamps flickered in enclosed courtyards. Suleiman valued poetry. He wrote it himself, under a pseudonym. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, rulers turn reflective. Power looks different at night. Less triumphant. More fragile. Let's gently shift to something stranger. In the 18th century, George III experienced episodes of mental illness. Historians debate the exact diagnosis. What we know is that his nighttime routines became erratic during periods of instability. He would talk rapidly. Pace. Speak to attendants for hours. At other times, he was calm. Domestic. Fond of his large family. But the night amplified his vulnerability. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz endured these cycles quietly. Royal bedrooms were not serene retreats. They were often theaters of health crises. Now let's drift into a more domestic elite setting. A noble household in 15th century Burgundy. The lord sleeps heavily after wine. The lady lies awake. Why? Because childbirth looms. Medieval noblewomen faced repeated pregnancies. Often beginning in their mid-teens. At night, discomfort intensified. Servants dozed nearby. Midwives remained on call. Sleep was shallow. Letters from noblewomen reveal exhaustion. Anxiety. A quiet longing for stability. Their husbands worried about lineage. They worried about survival. Midnight routines, for them, involved prayer. Lots of prayer. Now let's wander back to France. Marie Antoinette was not known for strict bedtime discipline. At Palace of Versailles, she hosted late-night gambling sessions. Card games stretched into early morning. She sought escape in diversion. But behind the silk gowns and powdered hair, there was pressure. Her marriage to Louis XVI was initially unconsummated for years. Court gossip circulated constantly. So while candles burned low, Marie Antoinette cultivated an image of charm and leisure. It was partly performance, partly distraction. Midnight, again, becomes emotional terrain. Let's float to Russia. Peter the Great disliked excessive ceremony. He preferred activity. Even at odd hours. Peter sometimes worked late into the night. Drafting reforms. Planning shipbuilding projects. Occasionally performing manual labor himself, because why not personally build a navy? He also hosted intense gatherings. Drinking. Debating. Enforcing social changes with stubborn enthusiasm. Sleep, for Peter, was secondary to ambition. His wife, Catherine I of Russia, adapted to his rhythm. She rose from humble origins. Learned quickly. Midnight in their court could be raucous. Or unexpectedly quiet. Because reformers still need rest. Now let's soften everything again. Imagine a monastery. Stone walls. Cold corridors. Monks practiced nocturnal prayer. Matins. They rose in the dark. Lit candles. Chanted psalms. Sleep was structured around devotion. No royal drama. No succession anxiety. Just repetition. And there is something deeply calming about repetition. Meanwhile, in merchant households across Florence or Antwerp, midnight might involve ledger review. Accounts checked by candlelight. A merchant calculating risk. If a shipment fails. If a debtor defaults. Fortunes shifted quietly at night. Not with explosions. With arithmetic. Let's drift to one more royal figure. Catherine the Great valued discipline. She rose early. But she also read late. Correspondence filled her evenings. Philosophical works. Letters from Voltaire. She curated her image carefully. Midnight, for Catherine, was intellectual space. She believed in Enlightenment ideas. And also in absolute authority. An interesting combination. As we glide through these unseen hours, notice how similar they feel. Despite crowns. Despite titles. Despite wealth. Midnight equalizes. The king worries. The queen prays. The noblewoman shifts uncomfortably. The merchant counts. The monk chants. The ruler drafts another decree by fading candlelight. There is no dramatic music here. Just breathing. The soft crackle of fire. Occasional footsteps in corridors. History in pajamas, essentially. And perhaps that is the most intimate version of it. Not in armor. Not in ceremony. But in vulnerability. In sleeplessness. In quiet thought. So as we let this part drift toward its own rest, imagine those ancient rooms. The curtains drawn. The guards posted. The candles burning low. And the people inside them. Not quite asleep. Not quite at peace. But human. In the next part, we'll ease into the early morning rituals that followed these restless nights. The elaborate dressing ceremonies. The fragile egos. The slightly absurd ways elites prepared to face the day. For now, let the clock strike gently. And let the unseen hours settle around you like heavy velvet curtains.